Welcome to my channel. I'm Nancy Thompson, here to share folk tales, thrilling mysteries, and all sorts of stories. Join me for today's tale. It was just past midnight when Mary Thompson finished washing the laundry. She collapsed onto her creaky bed, her body aching from head to toe. Staring up at the rough, weathered ceiling of her small room, tears slowly welled up in the corners of her eyes. She missed her family. The Thompsons had once been a modestly well-known family in their little rural town. Her father used to trap snakes, rattlers and copperheads mostly, before switching to selling fabric at the local market. Over the years, he'd built up a decent livelihood, enough to support his two kids, Mary and her younger brother. But then, out of nowhere, disaster struck. It was a frigid winter night, the kind that chills you to the bone. They say it started when a thief, folks called him the Night Spider, snuck into the barn. He didn't just rob the place blind, he set a ruthless fire that swallowed everything. Mary's little brother was still young back then, sleeping in the same room as their parents. All three of them perished in the blaze. Mary, who'd been staying in a separate room, was pulled out alive by a neighbor. She survived, sure, but the howling wind only fanned the flames higher, doubling the destruction. The fire reduced everything, the house, the barn, the Thompson family's hard-earned livelihood, to ashes. For over a decade, Mary bore the weight of that loss, tasting every bitter hardship life could throw at her. 2 years ago, Mary found work as a housemaid for one of the town's big shots, Thomas Jackson. Thomas wasn't a local, he'd rolled into town years back, bought up a sprawling property, and settled down. Even though he was an outsider, he made a name for himself pretty quick. The man had a knack for business, and before long, he'd carved out a solid place in the community. Thomas ran a hefty operation. His estate stretched across acres, a grand old house with more rooms than you could count. Inside, it was bustling with maids and hired hands, all keeping the place running like clockwork. After Mary started working for Thomas Jackson, she never got the cushy jobs like serving tea or pouring water. Her days were filled with rough, back-breaking chores, hauling water, scrubbing laundry, and mending clothes. Thomas had a big family, and on top of that, Mary was just one of the grunt workers among the maids. She was busy from dawn till dusk, sometimes even later. Lucky for her, she'd long since shaken off any spoiled habits from her old life. Over 10 years of scraping by on her own had toughened her up, teaching her grit and know-how. She had a stubborn streak and a clear head on her shoulders. Day after day, she kept at it. Sure, it was grueling, but at least it put food on the table. Without this gig, how else was a lone girl like her supposed to survive? Even though the work was tough, Mary never complained. The tears pooling in her eyes that night weren't about the job, they were for her family. With those tears still lingering, she drifted off to sleep. By 4 in the morning, before the sun even thought about rising, she was awake again. After dragging herself out of bed, Mary headed to the back courtyard to fetch water. She had to fill the troughs for the livestock and haul buckets for the house. Every drop was on her. Today, the Jackson place was expecting company. Some local sheriff's deputies who were buddies with Thomas from out of town. She'd barely made it to the courtyard when something leaped out from the shadows and lunged at her face. Mary stumbled back, helpless, staring at the thing in front of her. It was a monkey, one of those scrappy little critters, that had jumped at her. The thing sprang into the air, looking downright ticked off. Perched on a low branch, it bared its teeth at Mary, snarling like it meant business. She ducked her head and froze in the courtyard, not daring to swat at it or even yell. Every maid in the Jackson household knew this monkey was Thomas's pride and joy. No one could figure out why, but the man treated that animal like gold. Word was, Thomas doted on it so much he'd even sworn it in as his brother in some half-serious ceremony. Folks couldn't wrap their heads around it, a grown man buddying up with a monkey like that. It left everyone scratching their heads, but Thomas never bothered to explain himself. And that monkey? It had the run of the place because of Thomas's soft spot. The little beast had a mean streak, always scratching folks or causing trouble. Worse yet, if you crossed it, you might end up with a nasty bite. That had happened before. One of the hands got chomped so bad he didn't make it. Thomas just paid off the guy's family, and that was that. No fuss, no consequences. The monkey stayed free as ever, never facing so much as a scolding from its master. To a critter like that, Mary was small potatoes. She wouldn't dream of messing with it. Most days, she'd spot it coming and hightail it the other way. But here's the weird part, that monkey seemed to have it out for her, like they had some personal score to settle. It'd go out of its way to mess with her, almost like it wanted to get a rise out of her. Mary didn't dare take the bait. She'd just grit her teeth and take it. In her head, she'd curse it out, calling it every name in the book, but she never let a word slip out loud. This time, as she stepped into the courtyard, the monkey hopped off its branch and trailed right behind her. In a flash, it was darting around, swinging a stick it had gnawed into a sharp point with its teeth. Mary's heart raced. She was terrified that thing might jab her from behind. A poke from that stick wasn't no joke. It could do some real damage. Caught between fear and frustration, she froze, unsure what to do. Just then, heavy footsteps cut through the tension, stepping between her and the monkey. Mary breathed a sigh of relief, grateful to see who'd come to her rescue. It was Lee Carter, a lanky guy about 20 years old, one of the hired hands at the Jackson place. Lee was a quiet type, born mute, so he couldn't talk, but he had a good heart and always kept an eye out for Mary. The monkey glared at Lee standing there, then grudgingly tossed the stick aside. It scampered up the courtyard wall, chattering and grinning at Lee a few times before disappearing over the top. Mary let out a shaky breath, turning to Lee with a thankful nod. He blushed, scratched his head, and shuffled over to the well to help her haul water, not saying a word. Well, he couldn't, but she got the gist. Life for the help of the Jackson estate was dull and relentless, same old grind day in and day out. After fetching water and splashing it around the troughs, 3 days had passed in a blur. By the time Mary and Lee got around to eating, everyone else had already finished. The two of them just picked at the leftovers, no complaints. They'd barely swallowed their last bites when a ruckus kicked up from the front yard, Thomas's booming laugh mixed with a bunch of rowdy voices. A handful of curious workers, Mary included, peeked over the back wall to see what was up. She squinted and spotted Thomas's out-of-town pals, sheriff's deputies, rolling in, led by a guy with a bushy beard. The bearded guy was about 40, built like a bear and tough as nails. His name was Dan Baxter, a local lawman who hunted down crooks for a living. He didn't know Mary from Adam, but she sure knew him. Years back, when the Thompson place went up in flames, Dan was the deputy who'd poked around the ashes, trying to piece it all together. But the fire had wiped out every clue, leaving him with nothing to show for it. Now here he was, chatting and laughing with Thomas like old buddies. Dan stood there, thumbs hooked in his belt, cracking jokes while Thomas ribbed him back. "Dan, you're supposed to be some hotshot lawman," Thomas said with a smirk. "Been at this over 10 years. How come you still haven't nabbed that night spider? Need me to hire some extra muscle for you?" Dan let out a big laugh. "That's the trouble with you rich folks, always paranoid when you've got cash to lose." His face turned serious though. "The night spider's a slick one, I'll give him that. Moves like a greased jackrabbit. My boys ain't lazy, they just can't pin him down. But don't you worry, Thomas. Your place is crawling with people, he'd be crazy to try anything here." Thomas sighed, shaking his head. "All these years, and you've got no leads? Not one lousy break." Dan scratched his beard. "The boys say he's short, maybe even a woman. Me, I reckon he's a guy, born small, a runt maybe. Picked up some sneaky tricks somewhere and turned to thieving. Last time we got close, we lost him in the dark. But mark my words, we'll get him eventually." The group kept jawing, then headed inside with Thomas, probably for a round of drinks, judging by the kitchen hands scurrying around. Mary brushed her hair back, tucking it behind her ear, and flashed Lee a quick smile before heading back to her room. She grabbed a needle and thread, settling in to mend some torn clothes, but her mind wouldn't quit. Dan and Thomas's talk kept replaying in her head, stirring up old wounds. She couldn't shake the thought that the night spider was behind her family's fire all those years ago. It made sense, a thief like that hitting her folks' place, then torching it to cover his tracks. But one thing nagged at her: the spider was just a crook, not some arsonist. Why burn her house down and no one else's? If he was just after loot, Mary might have let it go, chalked it up to bad luck. But her parents and little brother had died in that fire. How could she not hate the guy? The grudge sat heavy in her chest, impossible to shake. She pricked her finger with a needle, and tears welled up again, spilling over this time. Even if it was the night spider, what could she do about it? Dan Baxter and his crew, best lawmen around, couldn't catch him, hadn't even seen his face. A girl like her, all alone, didn't stand a chance. By noon, Lee showed up, sneaking her a couple of ripe peaches. Mary's eyes widened. Those were from Thomas's private stash, off-limits to the help. Only Thomas and his head housekeeper, Lou Grayson, got to eat those peaches. Lee, being mute and low on the totem pole, sure didn't have dibs, so where'd he get them? The only place made sense was Thomas's personal quarters. Stealing from there was a one-way ticket to trouble, caught red-handed, and you were done for. But Mary had it wrong. Lee hadn't swiped them himself. That darn monkey had nabbed the peaches, then tossed them around like toys. Lee found them scattered in the dirt, couldn't bear to let them go to waste, and brought them to Mary instead. Too bad he couldn't explain. His hands waved, trying to mime the monkey, but she didn't catch on. She was about to stash the peaches when the door burst open, and her blood ran cold. Standing in the doorway was Lou Grayson, the head housekeeper, leading a couple of rough-looking hands. Lou was pushing 50, a wiry guy with a mean streak a mile wide. Folks called him Three-Whip Lou, because he could lay a man out with just 3 lashes, cold as ice and twice as hard. Back in the day, he'd been a regular worker like Mary, but he'd climbed the ranks by cracking down on the rest of them. If someone slipped up, Lou'd tie them to a tree out back and let the whip fly. He and Mary had tangled before, nothing big, just enough for him to hold a grudge. Now, with those peaches in her hands, she knew she was in deep. Lou's eyes locked on the fruit, and a nasty grin spread across his face. Well, caught you sticky-fingered, huh? Fancying yourself some of the boss's peaches? Guess you sent some Ione to swipe em for you. That's a luxury you don't get to touch. Mary's face went white, her throat tight. She stammered, trying to explain, but Lou wasn't having it. His grin vanished, replaced by a snarl. Take her out back, tie her to the tree. Let everybody see what happens when you get greedy. Lee stepped forward, eyes wide with panic. He'd brought the peaches, and now Mary was paying for it. He tried to block her, but the hands grabbed him too, pinning him down. Soon enough, both Mary and Lee were hauled out to the courtyard, ropes biting into their wrists as they were lashed to an old oak. The other workers gathered round, muttering under their breath, mad as hell but too scared to speak up. Everybody hated Lou's guts, but crossing him meant trouble no one could afford. All they could do was watch as he loomed over Mary and Lee, whip in hand. Lee's face twisted with guilt. He'd messed up bad, and Mary was caught in the crossfire. She braced herself, wondering if she could take Lou's lashings without breaking. No matter how much the others despised him, no matter how Lee squirmed against the ropes, Lou was in his element. His eagle-sharp eyes bored into Mary, smug as can be. You think you can cross me in this house? He sneered. Let's see if you've got any fight left after this. He cracked the whip in the air a few times, the sharp snap making folks flinch. Some of the maids turned away, unable to watch. Others shut their eyes or stared at the ground. Lou raised the whip high, ready to bring it down on Mary, when a shout cut through the yard. Heads turned. It was Dan Baxter, the sheriff from earlier, striding into the courtyard. He'd been up front, knocking back drinks with Thomas, when nature called. On his way to the outhouse, he'd heard the commotion and wandered over. Now he stood there, watching Lou with the whip raised, and didn't say a word at first. Lou puffed up, not liking the interruption. This is Jackson family business, Sheriff. No need for outsiders to butt in. Dan just ambled closer, hands in his pockets. Lou swung the whip anyway, but before it could land, Dan's hand shot out and snatched at midair. With one hard yank, he sent Lou stumbling, then ripped the whip clean out of his grip. Lou hopped up, red-faced and hollering, "What's it to you? This is our rules." His rant got cut short by a loud crack. Dan turned the whip on him, landing a stinging lash across his cheek. Lou hit the dirt, clutching his face and howling. The crowd held their breath, secretly cheering inside as Dan cracked the whip again. Lou rolled around, bawling like a kid, loud enough to wake the dead, or at least get Thomas's attention. Sure enough, Thomas came barreling out with the other deputies in tow, looking baffled. "What in tarnation's going on?" he demanded, eyeing Dan and his whipped-up housekeeper. Dan tossed the whip aside and gave Thomas a cool look. "You're ruthless, who, Thomas? What had these two tied up here do to deserve a beating from your attack dog? This some kind of frontier justice I don't know about." Thomas's face darkened. He'd built a good name in town, and this kind of mess could tarnish it fast. "Lou, what's this about?" he barked. Lou scrambled up, spitting out the peach story, how Lee stole him and gave him to Mary. Lee waved his hands frantic-like, pointing at the air, trying to mime something about the monkey. The crowd caught on quick. Everyone knew that Critter was a klepto, and Thomas knew it better than anybody. Dan raised an eyebrow, and Thomas sighed, rubbing his temples. No way he'd punish that monkey though, it was his baby. So Lou was the one left holding the bag. "Looks like you got schooled today, Lou," Thomas said, voice low and sharp. "Dan here did me a favor putting you in your place. Next time you pull something like this, you're out on your ear, pack your bags and git." Lou's jaw dropped, his eyes watering, but he didn't dare argue. He slunk off, tail between his legs, while the others untied Mary and Lee from the tree. Mary stepped over to Dan, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you, Sheriff. I over you won." Dan blinked, squinting at her like he'd seen a ghost. You're that Thompson girl, ain't you?" Mary nodded, then shook her head quick, signaling him to keep it quiet. Dan didn't press, just tipped his hat and went back to drinking with Thomas. Later though, he tracked her down before heading out. "Listen, Mary," he said, voice low. "I'm sorry I couldn't figure out that fire back then. Never got to the bottom of it, and that's on me. Hier is weer je life. Memorize it. You ever need help, or if this place gets rough, you come find me." Mary thanked him over and over, her heart full, and Dan gave her a nod before riding off. Lou wasn't done though. He'd taken a hit, and his pride was stinging worse than his face. He'd wanted to break Mary good, and instead, he'd been the one humiliated. A guy like him didn't let that slide. He couldn't go after her outright, not with Thomas's warning ringing in his ears, but he wasn't above playing dirty. Some of his cronies, the type who kissed up to him daily, huddled close and hatched a plan. They'd mess with her in the shadows, scare her, wear her down. What could one girl do against a pack of them? Mary didn't know it yet, but Lou was brewing trouble, and it was headed her way fast. That night, Mary was bone-tired, hunched over her sewing after a long day. A rustling sound perked her ears up, something skittering around the room. She tilted her head, listening hard, and her gut told her what it was before her eyes confirmed it: a snake. Sure enough, she turned and saw it, a thick rattler slithering out from under the table, straight for her. Most folks would have screamed, but Mary didn't flinch. Quick as a flash, she grabbed it right behind the head, pinning its jaws shut, then clamped its body with her other hand. The snake froze in her grip, stiff as a board. It was big, arm-sized, mean-looking too. A house like Thomas's, crawling with people, shouldn't have rattlers sneaking in. Then it hit her. This was Lou's doing, his slimy way of getting even. Mary's blood boiled, the nerve of that bastard. If she'd been some dainty gal, a snake like this in the dark would have spelled doom, either scared to death or bitten dead. Lou was low, lower than dirt. Thing is, he didn't know her pa had been a snake trapper, taught her every trick in the book. She'd learned how to snatch em and tame em, skills she never thought she'd need again, until now. But what good was hating Lou? She couldn't march up and slug him, not without proof. The snake started twitching, coming to in her hands, its tail wrapping tight around her arm. She studied it closer, spotted the bulge of eggs inside. A mama rattler, caught up in Lou's scheme. "It ain't your fault," she muttered, sighing. "You're just a critter, and I'm just a nobody. Go on, get outta here. Hope we don't cross paths again." She cracked the back window and tossed it out, watching it slither off into the brush. Mary stayed up till dawn, eyes wide open, wrestling with what to do. She'd half a mind to storm over and call Lou out, but as the sun peeked up, she cooled off. What was the point? That snake-slinging coward would just deny it, and she didn't have a shred of evidence to wave in his face. Folks wouldn't believe her over him, not without something solid. She swallowed the anger, choking it down like bitter medicine, hoping Lou'd get bored and leave her be. But she'd underestimated just how rotten he could get. Guys like Lou thrived on pushing folks around. He figured she'd dodged the first snake by dumb luck. The next night, he upped the ante, slipping another rattler into her room. When Mary nabbed that second snake, she'd had it. Lou was crossing a line she couldn't ignore. If she kept playing nice, he'd never stop. She pinned the rattler under a washtub, keeping it trapped, and hatched a plan. Come morning, she did her chores like nothing was up, then grabbed a basket and slipped out alone. By noon, she was back, setting the basket in her room without a word. No one batted an eye. Mary running errands wasn't news, just part of her grunt work for Thomas. Inside that basket, though, something hissed and rustled. She lifted the washtub, grabbed the trapped snake, and tossed it in with the rest, a wriggling mess of a dozen rattlers she'd caught herself out in the wild. Her pa's old tricks had paid off, and now she had ammo to turn the tables on Lou. 3 nights later, the Jackson place was dead quiet, not a lamp flickering. Mary gripped her basket of snakes, standing by her door, and took a deep breath. She was about to step out when a faint noise stopped her cold. Peering through the crack in the door, she saw a shadow drop from the roof, a short, wiry figure dressed in black, moving like a cat. The night spider. Her heart thudded, but she clamped her mouth shut, barely breathing. This was him, the thief who'd plagued the county for years, and he was here, sneaking into Thomas's place. The figure scratched his head, and a faint clink came from a sack he carried, stuffed full by the sound of it. Mary frowned. If he was the night spider, out to rob Thomas blind, why lug around a bag already loaded with loot? Then the figure turned, scanning the dark, and Mary's jaw dropped. Under the dim moonlight, she saw a monkey's face staring back. Thomas's monkey, blinking and scratching like it owned the night. She blinked hard, thinking she'd lost it, but there it was, scampering off toward the main house. It stopped outside Thomas's room, tapped the door light, and slipped inside when a voice grumbled, "Come in, ain't locked." Mary ditched her basket and crept after it, heart pounding. She heard muffled voices from inside Thomas's room but didn't dare linger. She hightailed it back to her own spot, hands shaking as she sank onto her bed. What the hell was going on? That monkey wasn't just some pet, it was up to something, and Thomas was in on it. A rustle at the window snapped her out of it. She whipped around and saw that Mama Rattler she'd let go, coiled on the sill, staring her down. Her nerves were shot, body trembling, when the snake opened its mouth and clear as day spoke, "You spared my life, so I owe you one. Lend me a dress, and I'll pay you back." Mary jolted upright, gasping. She was on the floor, not the bed. She'd passed out cold from the shock, and the talking snake was just a wild dream. But the monkey? That felt too real to be a nightmare. She glanced at the window, and there it was again, the rattler watching her. Dream or not, her head spun, and she couldn't shake the feeling something big was brewing. By sunrise, Mary was back at her chores, quiet as a mouse, mulling it all over. She tracked down Lee and spilled everything, well, as much as she could, with his nods and hand signs filling the gaps. After they finished up, she holed up in her room, waiting, nerves on edge but mind made up. Her folks' deaths weren't some accident, she could feel it in her bones now. No turning back once she started down this road. That night, she cracked her door open, and there was Lee, waiting like she'd asked. She waved him inside, laid out her plan in a whisper, then slipped past him into the dark. Lee grabbed her arm, worry all over his face, but she gave him a tight smile and shook him off, heading straight for Thomas's room. Thomas looked up, startled, as Mary barged in, standing bold in his doorway. "What in the Sam Hill are you doing here this late?" he snapped, his face twisting from surprise to irritation. "Folks'll talk, girl, what's this about?" Mary didn't blink, staring him down like she could peel the truth off him. "You're the night spider, ain't you, Thomas?" His eyes went wide, a flicker of panic crossing his face before he forced a laugh. "You're off your rocker, kid. You got no idea who I am." But Mary wasn't backing down. "Years ago, you hit a house that wasn't worth much, my house. You torched it, left me the only one breathing. I've been piecing it together, and it's you." Thomas's smirk faded, his voice dropping low. "That was a fluke, a knocked-over lantern, nothing more." He stopped short, realizing he'd said too much, and Mary pounced. "Exactly. It's you and that monkey of yours, ain't it? You send him out to do the dirty work, nimble little thief nobody can catch. That's why the law's been chasing shadows all these years." Thomas chuckled, dark and bitter, leaning back in his chair. "Smart girl. Yeah, it's me and him, but so what? You figuring it out don't change a thing. You think you can waltz in here and walk out alive after calling me out?" His words barely hit the air when the door and windows busted open. Dan Baxter stormed in, deputies at his heels, guns drawn. The night spider, hunted for over a decade, was right there, and Dan's grin said he wasn't letting him slip this time. Earlier that day, Mary had tipped him off, swearing Thomas was the man. Dan hadn't bought it at first, but hearing Thomas confess with his own ears sealed the deal. Outside, a commotion kicked up, shouts and scuffling. 2 deputies dragged Thomas out, hands bound, while up on the roof, that monkey screeched, tangled in a mess of ropes and a big rattler coiled around it, pinning it down. Lou and a few of his goons tried to rush in, knives flashing, aiming to spring Thomas loose. But they froze. Dozens of rattlers slithered out, hissing and rattling, blocking their path. Some of them dropped their blades and hit the dirt, scared stiff. The snakes reeked of Mary's red work dress, Lee's doing. He'd rubbed that shirt all over the basket of snakes she'd caught, then let him loose. The rattlers, mad as hell from being nabbed, zeroed in on anything with her scent, chasing the monkey and spooking Lou's crew. Up top, the monkey thrashed, the snake squeezing tighter, then its skin split, and a scrawny little man tumbled out hollering. He tried to bolt, but a net dropped from nowhere, snaring him tight. The more he fought, the worse it got, till he was stuck good. The night spider, terror of the county for over a decade, was finally caught, and nobody saw it coming. It wasn't just one guy, but 2, Thomas and his so-called monkey. Turns out, Thomas hobnobbed with the town's bigwigs, scoping out who had what worth stealing. Then he'd sick his partner on him, a wiry little fella who'd slip into a monkey suit to pull off the jobs. Small, quick, and covered in that disguise, he'd vanish before anyone clocked him. Even if folks spotted him, they'd just see a monkey. No wonder the law never got close. Who'd have thought a slick operator like Thomas would lean on a trick that wild? In the end, it was a lone girl, Mary, who brought him down, a girl whose family he'd burned out years back. Talk about fate coming full circle. After they hauled Thomas and his fake monkey pal away, both spilled their guts. The list of crimes was long, too long, and the judge didn't blink. The pair got sent up for life, locked away where they couldn't hurt nobody no more. Mary, though? She'd settled her score. With the weight of revenge off her shoulders, she tied the knot with Lee, the quiet, big-hearted guy who'd stuck by her through it all. Dan Baxter even stood up as her witness, proud as punch. Better yet, he took her in like a little sister, swearing to look out for her from then on. After the wedding, Mary and Lee settled down with a little cash Dan kicked in as a gift. They opened a small diner in town, cooking up hearty meals folks couldn't get enough of. Business took off, and before long, they'd built it into something solid, bigger than the Thompson name had ever been back in the day. The couple was good people, always lending a hand where it was needed, and the townsfolk loved them for it. Word got around. Mary'd come from a decent family, lost it all in that fire, and clawed her way up from nothing. Hardship and heartbreak hadn't broken her, they'd forged her into something tougher, kinder too. That kindness paid off in ways she never expected. Letting that mama rattler go instead of crushing it? It came back to help her, rounding up its kin to trap the night spider's partner. And it wasn't just the snakes. Good folks like Lee and Dan pitched in too, helping her get justice and a shot at a happy life. Meanwhile, Thomas and his buddy thought they had it all figured out, greed driving them to snatch whatever they could. But that fire they set, the one that sparked their downfall, lit up their tracks for everyone to see. You can't keep that kind of ugly buried forever, eventually it catches up. Thomas was proof. All his money and schemes couldn't save him from the hole he'd dug. So what do you reckon? That's the end of Mary's tale, a wild ride from start to finish. Stick around for the next one, another folk yarn called The Doctor Who Gave a Poor Scholar $100. Years later, his wife figured out he'd been a sharper judge of character than she'd ever guessed. This one set back in the old days, colonial Virginia, where a guy named Frank Gilmore made his mark. If you liked this story, drop a comment below, hit that subscribe button, and share it around. Thanks for listening. See you in the next one. Here's our next folktale, The Doctor Who Gave a Poor Scholar $100. Years later, his wife figured out he'd been a sharper judge of character than she'd ever guessed. Back in colonial Virginia, during the late 1700s, there lived a fella named Frank Gilmore. He was just a kid when things went south. His folks got hit with a bad fever, the kind that sweeps through towns like wildfire. No money for a doctor, no medicine to be had, they didn't make it. Little Frank swore then and there he'd grow up to be a healer, patch folks up so no one else had to lose kin like he did. Trouble was, his parents left him nothing but debts and a leaky roof. No cash to apprentice with a proper physician, he was stuck. So Frank signed on as a cowhand for a local bigwig, Mr. Charles Wheeler, just to scrape by. Mr. Wheeler was a decent sort, not your usual hard-nosed landowner. He took a shine to Frank, saw how rough the kid had it, and cut him a break. Every month, he paid Frank a little wage, nothing fancy, but but enough to keep him fed and housed. Better yet, he let Frank tag along with his own son Junior, when the tutor came round to teach reading and ciphering. Frank soaked it up, grateful as all get out, and worked his tail off to show it. One day, Mr. Wheeler caught a nasty chill, puking and feverish, laid up something awful. They called in a few country docs, dosed him with tonics and herbs, but nothing took. He was fading fast, and Mrs. Wheeler, Maggie, was beside herself, watching her husband waste away. Then Maggie remembered a story about a doctor in the city, Silas Harper. Folks swore he could cure anything. He charged an arm and a leg, sure, but if he saw you, you walked away fixed. Maggie wasn't about to be a widow at 40. She grabbed a pouch of coins, hitched up the wagon with a couple of hands, and hightailed it to fetch Silas herself. Silas was 60-something, a grizzled old coot who loved money more than most loved their kin. But the man knew his craft. He took one look at Charles Wheeler, sized up the sickness, and scribbled out a recipe for a tea, boiled it up himself too. After one cup, Charles, who'd been flat on his back for weeks, sat up like he'd never been sick, strolling around the house by sundown. Frank saw the whole thing, and it lit a fire in him. Right there in front of everybody, he dropped to his knees and bowed his head 3 times to Silas. "Sir, please, take me on as your apprentice," he begged. Silas squinted down at him, then laughed after hearing who he was. "You? A scrawny cowhand? Stick to your herd, boy, why'd I waste my time on you?" Frank didn't budge, his face dead serious. "It's for folks like my parents. They died, 'cause we couldn't pay for help. I want to learn medicine, save the poor who can't afford it. I'm dead set on this." Silas scratched his chin. "That's a fine dream, kid, but it ain't cheap. $60 up front to study under me, then I'd have to see if you've got the brains and the grit. You got that kind of coin?" Frank's shoulders slumped. "These past years, working for Mr. Wheeler, I've saved up $8 tops. The rest, could I owe you? I'll pay it back with interest once I'm earning." Silas hooted like it was the funniest thing he'd heard all year. "Oh me? Boy, you're a riot." He turned to Charles, still chuckling. "This cowhand of yours is a real dreamer, Wheeler." Then his face hardened, and he shook his head at Frank. "Even if you had the money, you ain't got the smarts for it. I don't take dimwits, ruins my reputation." "No dice." Charles piped up, frowning. "Hold on, Silas, you saying he's not sharp enough? If he's got the knack, I'd spot him the $60 myself. But you're calling him dumb, that's a low blow." "Yup, he's not cut out for it," Silas said, firm as a rock. "Don't got the head for medicine, ain't no way he's learning my trade. I don't care how much you'd pay, Wheeler, I won't take on a fool and tank my good name. That's that." He tipped his hat to Charles, said his goodbyes, and headed out, ignoring Frank's pleas trailing behind him. But Frank wasn't the quitting type. He tailed Silas back to the city on the sly, then parked himself outside the man's house, kneeling there 3 days and nights straight. Silas didn't budge, didn't even crack the door. Instead, he sent his 2 hired boys out to shoo Frank off like a stray dog. Still, Frank hung on, dirt-streaked and stubborn as a mule. A few days later, Silas rode out to treat another rich fella in the sticks. This time, no fancy wagon, just him and his medicine bag, trudging alongside the guy's servant. Half a day's walk wore the old man out, panting, sweating, and dragging his feet. They hit a shady patch of woods, and Silas plopped down to catch his breath, the servant sitting nearby. Out of nowhere, a gray wolf slunk out of the trees, drooling and eyeing them like supper. The servant bolted, young legs carrying him off in a flash, leaving Silas alone. The wolf didn't chase, just locked onto Silas, who crumpled, legs too shaky to run. He figured he was done for, dropping to his knees and begging the beast. "Spare me, big fella, I'm old tough chewing. I'll bring you a fat sheep next time, swear it." That wolf didn't speak English, naturally. It lunged, jaws aiming for Silas's head. He yelped, toppling over, when a kid burst out of the brush, swinging a long stick. "Don't worry, mister, I've got you." It was Frank, hollering as he cracked the wolf square on the skull. The beast snarled, turning to snap at him, but Frank held his ground, jabbing and swinging till it yelped and hightailed it back into the woods. Silas, sprawled in the dirt, blinked up and realized who'd saved him, that scrawny cowhand he'd brushed off. Frank had been shadowing him ever since the city, dead set on begging for a shot one more time. He'd tagged along on this trip, waiting for his moment, and ended up pulling Silas out of the fire, or the wolf's jaws leastways. Silas owed Frank his hide, and he knew it, grateful sure, but still ornery. He wasn't ready to take him on as an apprentice, pride too thick for that. Frank dropped to his knees again, bowing low. If you won't take me as a student, fine, I won't push no more. But let me work at your shop, mister. I'll fetch herbs, sweep floors, whatever, for free. Just gimme a cot and a meal a day, that's all I ask. Silas rubbed his beard, sizing him up. Boy, you're a stubborn cuss, and you just saved my bacon. All right, come to my apothecary. You can haul stuff around, but that's it. Frank's face lit up. Thank you, sir, thank you. He'd weaseled his way in, and that was enough for now. From then on, Frank bunked at Silas Harper's shop, working alongside the older hands. The place doubled as a clinic. Silas saw patients right there, and Frank was close enough to eavesdrop. He'd watch Silas scribble prescriptions, then handle the herbs himself when they passed through his hands. Bit by bit, he picked up the tricks, how to mix a tonic, what cured what. He got sharp on tough cases, memorizing remedies till he could rattle them off in his sleep. One day, Silas was out tending some farmer, leaving the shop quiet. A loudmouth named Hank Brody stormed in, clutching his gut and hollering about stomach pains, fit to keel over. Get Silas out here now, he barked. Fix me, or I'll bust this place up. Silas was still out, and the two shop hands froze, spooked by Hank's threats. They knew he wasn't bluffing. He'd smashed up a tavern once over a bad card game. But with Silas gone, they were stumped. Frank, though, sized Hank up quick. Guy was hiccuping and wincing, likely from something he ate gone sour. He darted to the shelves, grabbing sulfur powder, dried orange peel, and a pinch of ginger root. He ground it all into a fine dust, stirred it into hot water, and marched it over to Hank. Doc Silas saw this coming. Frank lied smooth as butter. He told me you'd show up with a bellyache and had me whip this up special. Drink it, cures you fast, guaranteed. Hank squinted at him. You're Silas's apprentice? Never heard of you. How'd he know I'd be sick? The other hands flinched. Hank wasn't dumb, and if this went south, he'd torch the place and blame them. They hissed at Frank to back off, scared he'd botch it and get 'em all in hot water. But Frank stood firm, betting he could fix Hank right. It's Silas's recipe, honest, he doubled down. He figured a guy like you'd eat something rotten sooner or later, left me here to handle it. Hank groaned, clutching his gut as another wave hit. No choice left, he snatched the cup and chugged the steaming brew. Sure enough, the growling in his stomach quit, pain fading like magic. He straightened up, grinning wide. Well, I'll be, old Silas is a wizard. That hit the spot. Here's a couple pennies for your trouble, kid. He flipped 2 coins into the empty cup and swaggered out. Silas rolled back in from the countryside not long after, hearing the buzz from the hands. He cornered Frank, eyes narrow. What'd that loudmouth have, and what'd you dose him with? I never taught you squat, how'd you pull that off? Frank shrugged, honest as daylight. Hank had gas and hiccups, ate something bad, I reckon. I mixed sulfur, peel, and ginger, like I saw in one of your old scripts. Worked like a charm. Silas nodded slow, piecing it together. So that's it. You saved my neck 3 years back, and now you've kept my shop from getting trashed with tricks you swiped from me. Ain't no reason left to hold out. Kneel down, give me 3 more bows, you're my apprentice for real now, door shut behind you. Frank dropped fast, beaming. Thank you, sir. He banged his head on the floor 3 times, officially in. From there, Frank threw himself into it, soaking up Silas's know-how like a sponge. Nearly 10 years he stuck at it, learning every remedy, every stitch, till he had the old man's whole bag of tricks down pat. By then, he could handle most anything short of the plague. Silas never married, never had kids. Once Frank signed on, he treated him like a son of his own. So when Silas hit his 70s, ready to hang it up, he handed the shop over to Frank. One summer morning, after laying out some final advice, Silas took off with a wandering preacher, chasing peace in his last days. Frank settled in as the new boss, and things changed fast. First thing Frank did was slash prices, ditched the fancy fees Silas loved so much. He cut the cost of herbs and tonics too, aiming to help folks who couldn't pay big. He didn't want anybody dying 'cause they were broke, like his folks had. The old hands fretted he'd go bust, but Frank proved him wrong. Word spread about the cheap cures, and patients flooded in. Poor farmers, mill workers, you name it. The shop raked in cash daily, even with slim profits. A penny or two per sale added up quick. Folks started calling him Doc Frank, singing his praises all over Virginia. A well-off merchant from the East End, Lawrence Tate, took notice, saw Frank's skill and big heart, and figured he'd make a fine son-in-law. Lawrence Tate sent a matchmaker to Frank's shop with a proposal: marry his daughter, Lucy Tate. Lucy was a local belle, pretty as a picture and sharp to boot. She'd been schooled in reading, writing, and even a little piano, the kind of gal rich boys dreamed of snagging. But Lucy and her pa turned their noses up at the fancy suitors. She wanted more than a stuffed shirt. When Lawrence pitched Frank to her, Lucy smiled soft. "I've heard of Doc Frank," she said. "Man like that, doing good for folks, is rare as hen's teeth. I'd be lucky to call him mine." So Frank and Lucy tied the knot. No muss, no fuss. After the wedding, she started pitching in at the shop, keeping books, mixing simples, making it hum even smoother. The shop boomed with Lucy's help, and Frank sank some profits into buying the lots next door, doubling the place's size. Not long after, Lucy had a baby girl, named her Fanny, short for Frances, after Frank. He was over the moon, doting on his little family. He told Lucy to stay home from then on, hired a maid to cook and clean so she could rest easy with Fanny. 3 years rolled by, spring turning to fall, and life was good. Then one evening, a scruffy fellow in patched clothes showed up at the shop, towing a kid maybe 5 or 6 years old. He spotted Frank and shuffled over, fists clenched nervous-like. "Frankie, you remember me? It's Charlie Wheeler." Frank stared a minute, then it clicked. Charlie was Mr. Wheeler's son, the one he'd studied with way back. Charlie grabbed Frank's hand, tongue-tied for a spell. Turns out, 10 years prior, bandits had cleaned out the Wheeler place, left him broke and broken. Charlie tried to bounce back with book learning, but it didn't pay the bills. After his boy Sammy came along, things got bleaker. His folks passed, his wife up and left, and now he was at rock bottom. He'd come to Frank, hat in hand, banking on old kindness. "Take Sammy on, Frankie," he pleaded. "Teach him what you know so he don't end up like me, starving in the dirt." Frank didn't hesitate, nodded right off. Not only did he take Sammy as an apprentice, he pressed $100 into Charlie's hands. "Get yourself straight," he said. "Start over." Frank wanted Charlie to stay and work the shop, but figured the man's pride wouldn't take it. Cash was the next best thing. Charlie took the money, near tears, thanking Frank till his voice cracked. He hugged Sammy tight, told him to mind Frank, then headed off with the bills tucked close. Lucy'd been there, watching it all, and after Charlie left, she pulled Frank aside, brow creased. "Honey, I love how you don't forget a favor," she said. "That's a real man. But $100, all at once? What if he's spinning a yarn, blows it on cards or whiskey and comes crawling back broke? We can't keep bailing folks out." Frank smiled easy. "Charlie's not that kind of fella. I know him. He won't show his face again begging. Trust me, he's solid." Lucy bit her tongue. Frank seemed sure, so she let it lie, just warned him to keep his eyes open down the road. Frank went back to doctoring, business as usual. Sammy settled in, eager as a pup, asked questions when he was stumped and studied hard, just like Frank had under Silas. Frank saw the spark in him and taught him everything, holding nothing back. 10 years flew by, and Sammy grew into a man, tall, steady, with all of Frank's healing know-how in his pocket. By then, Frank was getting gray, and Lucy nudged him to ease up, spend more time at home. They handed Sammy the reins at the shop, and he didn't disappoint, kept it running smooth as silk. Frank and Lucy watched Sammy shine, proud as could be. He was like family now. They even started thinking he'd make a good match for Fanny, who'd grown up tagging along at the shop. Sammy doted on her, and she took a shine to him too. Before long, folks were joking they'd end up hitched. Sure enough, they did, and the Gilmore clan got a little tighter. But good times don't always last. One day, Sammy treated a guy with a bad cold, mixed up the wrong dose, and the fella didn't pull through. Word spread fast, and the family sued, dragging Sammy into court. He got hauled off to the county jail, leaving Frank and Lucy scrambling to fix it. Fanny, pregnant by then, was a wreck, crying day and night over Sammy facing hard labor upstate. Frank pushed every string he could pull, but nothing budged, and the stress hit him hard. He took sick, fever and a cough that wouldn't quit. Then the hammer dropped. Rumors flew that the shop was peddling fake medicine. The sheriff's office swooped in, locked the place down, and since Frank's name was on the deed, they nabbed him too. It was a gut punch, house leaking, roof caving in kinda bad. Lucy burned through their savings, calling in every favor, desperate to spring Frank and Sammy from the clink. Just when it looked hopeless, a new county judge rode into town. This judge wasn't just anybody. He let Frank and Sammy out, cleared their names, no questions asked. Turns out, the whole mess was a setup by a rival doc, Tom Mason. Tom couldn't stand Frank's success, couldn't heal worth a lick, but he was a snake with dirty tricks. He'd paid off that cold patient to fake his death, framing Sammy, then slipped bad herbs into the shop's stock. After that, he greased some palms at the courthouse to seal the deal. It was airtight, except Tom didn't count on the new judge being Charlie Wheeler, Sammy's pa. Back when Frank gave him that $100, Charlie'd hit the books hard, passed the bar, and climbed the ladder till he landed here. He sniffed out Tom's scheme, flipped it on its head, and had him strung up for all to see. With the shop's name cleared, Frank and Sammy walked free. The day they reunited, Lucy gave Charlie a long look, then turned to Frank, shaking her head. I misjudged him, didn't I?
If it wären for Charlie, we'd be sunk, done for good.
Frank took her hand, smiling weary. Told you, doing right by folks pays off.
Never goes wrong in the end.
He glanced over at Charlie and Sammy, father and son grinning ear to ear, and let out a sigh. Life had thrown them a hell of a curve, but they'd come out the other side. The shop reopened, folks flocked back, and the Gilmore name held strong, stronger even with Charlie's clout behind it. And that's the tale of Frank Gilmore, start to finish.
What you think?
If it hit the spot, drop a line below, subscribe, share it round, you know the drill. Thanks for sticking with me, catch you in the next one.